that we're okay. I would just tell my mom that she raised us right. She taught us to forgive people. She taught us to love people. She taught us to show up. And I just wish that we could have found a way to help her and help have someone show up for her when this all happened. No one in our family ever doubted this. We just had no way to prove it back then.
She was someone's mother before she was anyone's victim. And her name was Janice Randall. She was a young woman in Graham, Washington, raising children in a house that was supposed to be a home but had long since stopped feeling like one. She was in the middle of a divorce. She was fighting for her kids. She was trying to get out. But by November of 1992, Janice Randall was dead, found on her bed. No drugs in her system, covered in bruises. And the man who put her there walked out of that house and told police she probably overdosed. He lived free for 34 years. Before we get to how that cover-up finally fell apart, let me take you back, because this story does not begin with a body on a bed. It begins with a woman who deserved so much more than the ending she got. Now, if you think 34 years is a long time to carry a secret, you are right. But people who think they got away with it often start to talk. They talk to their brothers. They talk to their children. They confess in pieces, not out of guilt, but out of something more complicated than that. Something closer to arrogance. Something that says, I did this and nothing happened and I want someone to know. That arrogance is what undid James Robert Randall in the end. But we are not there yet. Stay with me. Janice Randall was a mother first. She had children who adored her, friends who described her as someone whose presence filled the room in a way that was genuine, not performed. She built a life around the people she loved, and by all accounts, she loved hard. Her oldest daughter, Katie, was 14 years old when her mother was killed. Katie would carry the weight of that November morning for 34 years. She would raise herself in many ways on stories told by her mother's best friends, women who stepped in to fill the gaps because Janice no longer could. Janice's youngest daughter, Kuwitney, was only 18 months old the night she died. 18 months. Kuwitney was in a crib next to her mother's bed. She has no memories of her mother at all, only the knowledge of what she lost. For decades, Kuwitney did not dig into the documents. She had the basic paperwork that gets filed when someone dies, and she left it untouched. She was just trying to live. But Janice was not living in a peaceful house. By the fall of 1992, she and James Randall had separated. They were going through a divorce. There was a custody battle, there were threats, and there was a documented history of violence that authorities knew about long before that November night, because James Randall had already been convicted of assaulting Janice in the months before she died. A conviction, on record, in the system, and none of it was enough to stop what came next. James Robert Randall was not a stranger. He was not a shadow at the edge of the story. He was Janice's estranged husband and the father of their youngest child. He was the man whose name appeared on legal filings, whose face appeared in family photographs, and who, after Janice was found dead, sat across from investigators and told them she had probably overdosed on painkillers. He said she had a history of using them. He said it with enough confidence that the case was initially treated as a possible overdose. But here is what the court records would eventually show. In the weeks before Janice died, James Randall had been making threats. He had a domestic violence conviction already sitting on his record. The divorce and custody battle were contentious, and the version of events he gave police on that November morning contradicted the body investigators found when they walked through that bedroom door. Janice Randall was covered in bruises. There was evidence of a struggle. The scene carried the signs of a homicide. Therefore, when the autopsy came back clean, no drugs, no overdose, nothing in her system, investigators reclassified the case as a murder. But reclassifying something and proving it are two entirely different things. They had limited evidence. They had James Randall's story, and they could not establish probable cause for an arrest. So the case went cold, and James Randall went on with his life. Here is what living with a secret does to a person. Sometimes it silences them. And sometimes, especially when they believe they are safe, it makes them talk. Shortly after Janice died, James Randall allegedly told his younger brother what he had done. Not a confession dragged out of him, a disclosure. He told his brother how he staged the scene. He explained what he had done to make it look like she went on her own. And then, years later, James Randall allegedly told one of his own daughters. According to prosecutors, Randall told her that he had put a pillow over Janice's head, and he told her, "Just know it was me." That sentence, "just know it was me," lived inside that daughter for years. It sat alongside everything else she knew about him, alongside every visit, every custody arrangement, every moment she had to be in the same room with him because she had younger siblings on his side who she wanted to stay connected to.
In order to see my sister, my brothers and I had to deal with him our whole lives. In order to have access to her, I had to see him on a consistent basis, knowing what happened.
Katie Wacken has spoken about this directly. She knew. Her family knew. They had no way to prove it. But the knowing was always there. In the meantime, James Randall aged. He eventually moved into a care facility in Everett, Washington. By the time April of 2026 arrived, he was 68 years old. The shift came in 2025. Courtney Lewis, 18 months old in that crib, now a grown woman with children of her own, wanted her kids to know something about their grandmother. She wanted to be able to tell them who Janice Randall was, but Courtney realized she barely knew herself. So she started looking. She pulled documents she had never opened, not just the death certificate and the basic paperwork, the investigative records, the autopsy findings, the details that had been sitting in a file for over 3 decades. Here is what Courtney told Fox 13 Seattle about the moment she read them. "I never looked at some of the documents. We just had the basic documents when someone dies. I never looked at those, and when I looked at them, I knew exactly what was happening. And so I said, I need to figure this out." She did not stop there. She called Katie. Together, the sisters started gathering everything they could and bringing it to the attention of investigators. The Pierce County Sheriff's Office, specifically Detective Lindsay Kierkegaard, began re-examining the case with fresh eyes.
We do have hundreds of cold cases that are sitting on shelves, and they'll be re-reviewed when new evidence does come forward. And a lot of times it is a family member that finally can't hold that guilty conscience anymore and come forward with new evidence.
And this is the part that matters, because the evidence that had always been there looked entirely different once the confessions came forward. The bruising on Janice's body was consistent with a violent struggle. The lack of any drugs in her system had already disproven the overdose story decades earlier. And now there were people willing to go on record and say they had heard James Randall describe, in his own words, what he did to his wife and how he covered it up. That was enough. For 34 years, James Randall was a free man. He attended family events. He was present in the lives of his children. He went on living in a way that Janice Randall never got to. He was the man who controlled access to Janice's younger children, which meant Katie and her siblings had to maintain a relationship with him if they wanted to stay connected to each other. She has described this plainly. In order to see her sister, in order to maintain those sibling bonds that became the most important thing in the world after losing their mother, they had to deal with him. Consistently, for decades, knowing what he had done. That is not a metaphor. That is what it actually looked like. And this is the part of this case that I need you to sit with because it does not get talked about enough. James Randall was convicted of assaulting Janice before she died. That conviction existed. The threats existed. The history of domestic violence existed. And in 1992, none of it was sufficient to protect her. She was going through the legal process. She was separated. She was trying to leave. And she still ended up dead, with her 18-month-old daughter in a crib beside her. Katie Watkins said it herself outside the courthouse after her stepfather's arraignment. It is always the husband or the ex-husband. We have made strides since '92 in what we know to be true about domestic violence, but we have not done enough. She is correct. Investigators now believe that Janice Randall died during the night of November 7, 1992, the night before her body was found. The cause of death was not an overdose. It was a violent struggle with her estranged husband. According to what Randall himself allegedly described to family members, he used a pillow. When her body was discovered on November 8th, her youngest daughter was still in a crib beside her, 18 months old, alone in that room, alive. The medical examiner initially ruled the cause of death as undetermined. The autopsy would eventually strip away the overdose theory entirely, but without sufficient evidence to charge anyone, the case stalled. The Pierce County Sheriff's Office would later describe the investigation as having only breadcrumbs, nothing substantial enough to establish probable cause. That was not incompetence. That was the reality of a 1992 homicide investigation, where the surviving suspect controlled the narrative, and the only people who knew the truth were a toddler who could not speak it and a man who had every reason not to. On April 1, 2026, Pierce County deputies drove to a care facility in Everett, Washington. James Robert Randall was 68 years old. He was living in assisted housing. He had, by every outward measure, survived long enough to believe he had escaped consequence entirely. Body camera footage from the arrest shows deputies approaching him. You can hear his voice in the recording. Before the handcuffs go on, he asks, "What is this about?" Then he is led out to a waiting vehicle. He was booked into Pierce County Jail on April 1st on a charge of first-degree murder. Bail was set at $1 million. He was arraigned on April 2, 2026, at Pierce County Superior Court in Tacoma. He pleaded not guilty. His next scheduled hearing is April 29th. Outside the courthouse after that arraignment, Katie Watkins stood in front of cameras and said things that took decades to get to say. "I don't want to say I gave up hope, but I never thought I would see this in my lifetime. I accepted that. I was at peace with that until about a year ago." A year ago is when Kootenai started digging. Katie also said this, and I want you to hear it clearly. "Our mom was taken from her. She has no memories of her. My mom loved her very much. Very, very much. She loves her father, but she knows that he needs to be accountable, and she is willing to put aside all of that to make sure justice is met and that our mom's story is told." That is Kootenai she is talking about, the daughter who was in the crib, who has no memory of her mother's face, who in 2025 picked up a stack of documents she had never opened and read through them until she knew, with certainty, exactly what had happened in that bedroom. The Pierce County Sheriff's Office said in their statement that the new information and tips led to a thorough investigation with a new perspective, and that evidence uncovered during that renewed investigation contradicted the original account James Randall gave in 1992. Detective Lindsay Kierkegaard is credited by the family with the commitment that made this arrest possible. She is the name attached to the work that finally got this case off the shelf. There are hundreds of cold cases sitting on shelves in Pierce County alone. Investigators noted that after saying this out loud, they will be reviewed when new evidence comes forward. And a lot of times, it is a family member who can no longer hold it in, or in this case, a family member who simply started reading documents she had always had access to but never opened. Janice Randall's case is not unusual. That is the part that should sit with you after this video ends. She had a documented history of abuse in her relationship. She had filed for divorce. She was going through the legal process that is supposed to protect people in exactly her situation, and none of it kept her alive. In 1992, The tools available to investigators working domestic violence homicides were limited. The forensic technology was limited. The evidentiary standards were applied the same way to a murdered wife as to any other death investigation, and when the physical evidence was ambiguous, the case stalled. The system was not built to account for a suspect who told a convincing story, staged a scene, and then simply waited. But here is what changed. Courtney Lewis grew up. She had children of her own who wanted to know their grandmother. And somewhere in the process of trying to give them a story about who Janice was, she found the truth of how Janice died. The confession James Randall allegedly gave his brother and his daughter did not disappear. It lived in those people. It outlasted his confidence. It outlasted the cold case designation. And it outlasted his freedom. Katie Watkins said she would tell her mother one thing if she could. When a reporter asked her what that would be, she paused. And then she said, "That we're okay. I would just tell my mom that she raised us right. She taught us to forgive people. She taught us to love people. She taught us to show up. And I just wish that we could have found a way to help her, to have someone show up for her when this all happened." Janice Randall taught her daughters to show up. And they showed up for her 34 years later, with documents on a table and a phone call to a detective who was willing to start over. That is the legacy of this case. Not the arrest, not the charge. The daughters who refused to let the story end at a death certificate ruled undetermined. Janice Randall's youngest daughter was in a crib beside her the night she was killed. She has no memory of her mother's face. But in 2025, she sat down and read every document that existed about how her mother died, and she did not stop until her mother had a name attached to what happened to her. That is what showing up looks like. If you have ever known someone going through a dangerous separation, someone who checked all the warning signs and still felt like nothing would be done about it, I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think has to change? And if this case moved you, watch our breakdown of the Yale professor's father charged in his wife's decades-old murder. The links are on your screen now.